Hey kids, oh, I forgot my hat. Close enough. There we are. Alright, so we're learning about today colonial economies, and we just had that video on the intro page. It was a very insightful video on slavery, which is sort of the last part of the lesson. We go New England economy, middle colonies economy, and boom, down to the South. And so much of the South's economy was based on slave labor. But let's start at the very beginning. It's a really good place to start. So we learned that there are three regions when we study the colonies. They were populated by different people, they had different geographic features, and as a result, their economies were different. I'm going to summarize their economies in a nice graph form right here. We've got the New England colonial economy. So we're thinking like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, places like that. They had long winters and rocky soil, which made not great farming. As a result, many of the people were subsistence farmers, which means they were growing just enough to feed themselves. Everyone in the family worked, even the kids, to make what was needed, like clothes and candles. They couldn't go to the store to buy it. There were a number of small businesses, such as lumber mills, blacksmiths, gunsmiths, grain mills, shoemakers, and shipbuilding, which would come to be a huge industry in New England. Move down to the middle colonies, your New York, your Pennsylvania, places like that, New Jersey. More fertile soil and a little bit milder climate meant farmers could grow enough to actually sell. In Pennsylvania and New York in particular, farmers grew cash crops, which were pretty much crops that were easy to sell, like wheat, they could grow enough to sell. New York and Philadelphia were supposed to be bustling port cities and the most populous cities in the colonies. Industries, including lumber mills, mines, and small-scale manufacturing were around, and the population of the middle colonies was more diverse than that of New England. Remember, up in New England, they're like staunch religious folks, separatists, and Puritans. They were very, very close-minded. It's like you have to be like them. In general, remember that some of those guys went off and formed their own colonies. That's how you ended up with your Rhode Island, because they wanted a little more religious toleration. But for the most part, the vast majority of the populations up there were very, very religious and one-minded. All right, let's bust down to the South. You've got rich soil and warm climates, which made good large-scale farming, which you ended up with plantations. You've got cash crops, including rice and tobacco. Don't forget indigo. Most settlers in the South were farmers. There was little commerce or industry, and the trade was run by Europe, so it's almost all agrarian, very much farming down in the South. The Tidewater region, the flat plains near the coast, was dominated by the large plantations, which usually had 50 or more slaves. More inland, near the mountains, was the southern backcountry, dominated by small family farms with little or even no slaves. Remember, there were many more backcountry farmers than wealthy plantation owners, but the plantation owners ruled southern culture, government, and the economy. So I sort of had this elite few, the plantation owners, running things in the South, even though they were vastly outnumbered. All right. Oh, my picture disappeared, and there's a picture right here. So, it's supposed to be tobacco. Some huge crops in the colonies were tobacco and rice. Both were grown in the warm South. Tobacco was grown mainly in Maryland and Virginia. Tobacco is a labor-intensive crop. As more was planted and indentured servants ran low, more and more slaves were used to harvest that valuable plant. There were times when there was so much tobacco harvested that there was too much supply and the price went down so much they couldn't even make a profit selling it anymore. As a result, some farmers switched to growing other crops like corn and wheat. Now, rice is grown in a flooded field called a rice paddy, and it was farmed mostly in Georgia and South Carolina, where the climate was best for that. It is an exceptionally labor-intensive crop, and many slaves were brought into the rice paddies. Rice became very popular in Europe in the 1750s, fueling the demand for more rice, fueling the need for more slaves in the South. That brings us into the growth of slavery itself. So we learned a good deal about slavery in that nice introduction video. As the colonies grew, And with the prominence of labor-intensive crops like the rice and tobacco, the need for more slaves increased. These slaves were sold to European slave traders by West African kingdoms. A lot of times they were prisoners of war. In my studies, there's times where African kingdoms went to war with each other for the sole purpose of capturing people to sell into slavery. Now, the trip of the slaves from Africa to the Americas was called the Middle Passage. It was called such because it was the middle voyage in a route known as the triangular trade, which can be pictured here. So goods were moving here and there. You see, it looks like a triangle, and that middle passage is what brought the slaves into North America. Now, we heard about the conditions on those slave ships in the video. It was not good. Many died of disease, and those that did survive had to face the horrors of the slave market and then servitude. The life of a field slave was brutal, and only slightly better were the lives of the house slaves, which were more or less like maids and servers, things like that. Many states had slave codes, which were rules for the behavior and punishment of slaves. For example, slaves could not be taught to read. That was one of the big things in the slave codes. Some slaves, along the way, learned valuable skills like blacksmithing, things like that, and were able to earn enough money or earn or buy their freedom and join the small number of free African Americans in the colonies. Now, not all the colonies approved of slavery. Many of the Puritans up in New England refused to hold slaves, and the first group of people to speak against slavery, you might call them the very first abolitionists, were the Quakers from Pennsylvania. Remember William Penn was a Quaker, the Society of Friends? Those guys, they were the first ones to speak out against slavery, and they would really, we'll talk about them again when we get to the actual abolition movement way up in like marking period 3. As you may know from what history you know already, the slavery issue will have great consequences as we will study throughout the year and move further into American history. We'll get into that later. For today, you just have a quiz on the next page. Depending on which section you're in, it might have an essay question. It might not. So it's just on this information. You'll have multiple attempts. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, have a wonderful day.